The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and by Wednesday evening, Maggie Dugan was sitting on a westbound train with a single carpet bag, a second-hand copy of a botanical guide she'd tucked in at the last moment, and the burning knowledge that her father had just handed her the most severe punishment he could imagine, which told her everything she needed to know about the smallness of his imagination. Her name was Margaret Claire Dugan, though no one who loved her ever called her anything but Maggie, and the number of people who loved her had recently grown considerably smaller. She was 22 years old, with dark copper hair that refused to stay pinned, brown eyes the color of Good Creek water, and a mind that her father, Edmund Dugan of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to correct. She read books he hadn't approved. She argued with tutors. She turned down 3 marriage proposals from men who were perfectly suitable and perfectly dull. And 6 weeks ago, she had done the unforgivable thing, the thing that had finally exhausted Edmund Dugan's limited patience entirely. She had stood up in the middle of a dinner party, attended by some of Philadelphia's most respectable citizens, and told his business partner, Mr. Gerald Whitmore, that his views on the expansion of the rail lines through Indian Territory were not only morally bankrupt but factually incorrect, and she had backed every single word with citations. Edmund Dugan had not spoken to her for a full week after that evening. When he finally did speak, his voice had the quality of a man who has made an irrevocable decision. He told her she was going west. He had made arrangements. She would go to a cattle ranch in the territory of Colorado, near a town called Harlan Creek, and she would serve as a housekeeper and general helper to one Silas Kendrick, a rancher he had done some minor land business with 3 years prior. She would stay until she had learned the value of silence, of obedience, of knowing her proper place in the world. He had framed it as a sentence, the way a judge might frame a term of hard labor, and he had watched her face carefully, waiting for her to crumble. Maggie had not crumbled. She had thanked him, gone upstairs, packed her carpet bag, and pulled the botanical guide off the shelf because she had always wanted to see the plants of the Western Territories for herself. Now, watching the flat plains of Kansas give way to the first distant suggestions of Colorado's high country, the late afternoon light pouring gold through the smudged train window, Maggie pressed her palm against the cool glass and felt something she hadn't expected at all. She felt the loosening of a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying in her chest for years. Philadelphia fell away behind her with every mile of iron track, and whatever lay ahead of her, however difficult, however rough, however far from the parlors and dinner parties her father considered civilization, it was hers. Hers to navigate, hers to meet on her own terms. She pulled the botanical guide open across her knees and started reading about the flora of the high plains, and she didn't look back once. The town of Harlan Creek, Colorado, was not much to look at from the seat of the stage that carried her the final 30 miles from the rail depot at Pueblo. It was a single main street of weathered timber buildings, a general store, a livery, a hotel that looked as though it had been built in haste and never quite finished, a saloon whose sign had faded to near illegibility, and a small whitewashed church at the far end that seemed to be holding itself together by pure ecclesiastical will. But the mountains behind the town were something else entirely. They rose in the late afternoon light like a promise, purple and white and enormous, filling the entire western sky with a grandeur that made Maggie's breath catch in a way that no building in Philadelphia ever had. She climbed down from the stage with her carpet bag and stood on the main street of Harlan Creek, feeling the high-altitude wind catch at her hair and pull several pins loose before she could do anything about it, and she looked around for whoever had been sent to collect her. The man leaning against the post of the stage depot was not what she had pictured. She had pictured, in some vague way, a weathered and indifferent older man, someone who would look at her the way her father had looked at her for most of her life, as a problem that needed managing. The man leaning against the post was perhaps 30, possibly 32, with dark hair that was somewhat overlong and somewhat sun-bleached at the ends, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least 3 days, and the kind of physical ease in his body that came from years of hard outdoor work rather than from any particular leisure. He wore a plain canvas shirt, worn denim trousers, and boots that had seen considerable mileage. His hat was tilted at a practical angle against the afternoon sun rather than any fashionable one. He was also watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't dismissal, which was what she'd expected. It wasn't anything so simple as that. "Miss Dugan," he said, pushing off the post. "That depends on who's asking," Maggie said, because she'd been on a train and a stage for 3 days and her manners had been somewhat compressed by the journey. Something shifted in his expression. It might have been amusement. "Silas Kendrick," he said. "I run the Kendrick Ranch about 8 miles out. Your father wrote and said I should expect you." "He wrote to me as well," Maggie said. "He made it sound like a prison sentence." Silas Kendrick regarded her for a moment. He had green eyes, she noticed, the particular quiet green of deep water in late summer. "What did he say exactly?" "He said I was to come and learn the value of hard work and proper behavior." She picked up her carpet bag before he could reach for it. "He was attempting to punish me." "Was he?" Silas said. It wasn't quite a question. "He was." She looked at the mountains again, then back at him. "I don't think it's working the way he intended." Something in Silas Kendrick's face went very still, and then, quietly, he smiled. It was a small smile, not showy, just honest, and it rearranged his face entirely. "Well," he said, "the wagon's around back. It's a fair ride." The wagon ride was, indeed, a fair ride, and it was also the most purely beautiful thing Maggie had ever experienced. The road, if it could be called that, being more of a suggestion in the grass than an actual constructed path, wound through a valley that was green with spring grasses and threaded through by a creek that caught the last of the evening light. The mountains were to the west and north, still lit at their peaks even as the lower country softened into shadow, and the air smelled of sage and cold water and something green and new that Maggie couldn't name, but that settled in her lungs with the quality of a relief she hadn't known she needed. Silas drove the wagon in silence for a while, which she appreciated. He didn't seem to feel any pressure to fill quiet space with noise, which was already making her revise her initial categorization of him. "What did you do?" he said eventually, not looking at her. "I beg your pardon. Your father. What did you do that made him decide this was a punishment?" He still wasn't looking at her. He was watching the road, such as it was, with a relaxed competence that suggested he'd driven it 1,000 times. Maggie considered lying, then decided it wasn't worth the effort. "I embarrassed him in front of his business partner by knowing more about railroad land policy than either of them did and saying so out loud." The silence that followed had a different quality. That was it. That was the final straw. The previous straws include refusing 3 marriage proposals, arguing with 3 separate tutors, and once reading a legal brief during a church service, because the sermon was less interesting than the brief. Silas turned his head and looked at her then just briefly before looking back at the road. "What was the brief about?" "Water rights in the Dakota Territory," Maggie said. It was genuinely fascinating. He was quiet for another 100 yards. Then, in a voice that was entirely level and revealed almost nothing, he said, "I don't think you're going to be a punishment." The ranch came into view as the last light was leaving the sky, and it was nothing like what Maggie had imagined and everything like what she might have hoped. The main house was a sturdy, low-built structure of rough timber and stone, 2 stories with a long covered porch that faced the valley and the mountains beyond. There was a barn and several outbuildings in various states of repair, a series of corral fences weathered to a silver gray, and a kitchen garden to one side of the house that had been recently turned and was showing the first brave green tips of early plants pushing up through the dark earth. A bunkhouse sat at a comfortable distance from the main house, and as Maggie climbed down from the wagon, she could hear voices and the smell of a cook fire drifting from its direction. "You'll have the upstairs room on the east side," Silas said, carrying her bag without asking this time. "It's small, but it has a window that faces the mountains." "That's the best possible recommendation a room can have," Maggie said honestly. The kitchen was large and practical and slightly chaotic, which immediately made Maggie like it. There was a cast-iron stove that had been well used, a heavy work table, shelves of canned goods and flour and salt, a collection of mismatched pottery, and on the kitchen table, somewhat incongruously, a stack of newspapers that were only about 3 weeks old, which suggested that someone at this ranch was making regular efforts to stay informed about the wider world. "Those yours?" she asked, nodding at the papers. "Mostly." He set her bag at the foot of the stairs. "I get them when I go into Pueblo for supplies. The news is old by the time it arrives, but it's better than not having it." Maggie looked at the papers, looked at the man, and felt that knot in her chest loosen another degree. She was shown to her room, which was indeed small and indeed had the most spectacular window she had ever looked out of the mountains at night, with a half-moon rising and the first stars multiplying in the black sky above them, were something that she was fairly certain no amount of time would make ordinary. She stood at that window for a long time after Silas had said good night and gone back downstairs, just looking, feeling the cold of the glass against her palms and the warmth of the room at her back, and the strange, absolute rightness of being exactly where she was. Her father had sent her here to break her. She was already fairly certain it was going to do the opposite. In the weeks that followed, Maggie Dugan learned several things in rapid succession. She learned that running a cattle ranch household was substantially harder physical work than she had anticipated, and that this hardship did not bother her in the slightest. She learned that the high Colorado spring was variable and dramatic, capable of delivering sunshine and a blizzard within the same afternoon. She learned the names of the 3 ranch hands who worked for Silas: a wiry, older man named Pete who had been on the ranch for 9 years and seemed to regard the property as his personal responsibility; a young man of 20 called Danny who was enthusiastic and somewhat accident-prone; and a quiet, capable man named Jorge who had come up from New Mexico and who knew more about cattle and horses than anyone else on the property, including the man who owned it. She learned, over the course of many mornings, that Silas Kendrick was up before dawn without exception, and that he was usually in the kitchen when she came downstairs, drinking coffee at the table with one of his newspapers folded in front of him, not reading it so much as thinking at it, the way a person does when they're using the printed page as a surface to project their thoughts against. And she learned, in the particular way that one learns things that later seem inevitable, that Silas Kendrick was a great deal more complicated than his silence suggested. It started with small things. She found a shelf of books in the main room that she hadn't noticed on her first evening. Not a decorative shelf, not the sort of books chosen to impress, but the kind of collection that accumulates when a person actually reads. A worn copy of Darwin's work on natural selection, a volume of Shakespeare's histories, 3 different books on geology and land formation, a history of the Mexican-American War with notes written in the margins, and somewhat to her surprise, a fairly complete volume on the medicinal properties of Western plants. "You've read all of these?" she asked him one evening, pulling out the geology book and examining the margins, which were also annotated. He looked up from where he was repairing a piece of harness at the other end of the table. "Most of them, the geology one twice." "Why geology?" He set down the harness. "Because this land used to be underwater," he said, "and I find it useful to remember that." She looked at him. "Useful how?" "Keeps things in proportion," he said simply. "When the cattle prices drop, or the creek floods, or a fence line needs 3 days of work in the cold, it helps to remember that where you're standing was once the bottom of a sea." Maggie turned the book over in her hands. "That is either the most philosophical thing I've ever heard a rancher say or the most practical." "Could be both," he said, and went back to the harness. The first real conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon in late April, when a spring storm rolled in from the mountains with very little warning, and they both ended up on the covered porch watching it come. The storm was spectacular, the kind of enormous weather that Maggie had never seen on the eastern seaboard, where even major storms seemed somehow contained by the density of civilization. Here, the sky simply opened. Lightning walked down from the mountain peaks in long, bright legs. Thunder arrived several seconds later with a physical force you could feel in your sternum, and the rain came in sheets that turned the valley floor silver. They stood at opposite ends of the porch railing for a while, and then Maggie moved to the middle, closer to where he was standing because the view was better from there. She didn't think anything of it. He didn't move away. "How long have you had this ranch?" she asked. "8 years," he said. "I came out from Missouri in 1874. I was 22. What was in Missouri?" A pause. "My family's farm. My father died in 1873 and left it to my older brother, which was the right call, and then I had to figure out what I was doing with myself. So you came west." "It seemed like the honest thing to do," he said, watching the lightning. "When I didn't know what to do, I figured I'd at least go somewhere that matched how I felt." Maggie turned to look at him, which was a mistake or perhaps the opposite of one, because he was looking at her at the same moment. And for a second the lightning lit the side of his face and she saw the full shape of him, not just the practical, capable exterior but whatever was underneath it, the part that kept geology books with annotated margins and thought about ancient inland seas when the work got hard. "How old are you now?" she asked. 30, he said. "You?" 22. He nodded slowly, as though this information confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Your father said you were difficult," he said, in the tone of a man making a minor report. "My father's definition of difficult is being smarter than the men around you and declining to pretend otherwise," Maggie said, with a steadiness she was proud of. Silas was quiet for a moment. "He also said you were headstrong and argumentative and had no sense of your proper place." "All accurate," Maggie agreed. "I don't think any of those are bad things," Silas Kendrick said quietly, watching the rain. She had no idea what to do with that, so she stood beside him in the storm and listened to the thunder, and let the words settle into her the way good rain settles into dry ground. The cattle drive came in the first week of May, and it changed things, the way large physical events have a way of changing things between people who go through them together. Silas needed to move a herd of 260 cattle from the winter grazing range in the lower valley to the summer pastures at higher elevation, a drive of about 18 miles that would take the better part of 2 full days. Pete and Jorge and Danny were all hands on deck, and when Maggie appeared at the corral fence at 4 in the morning in her most practical clothes and her boots and told Silas she was coming, he looked at her for a long moment in the pre-dawn dark. "You've ridden a horse before," he said. It was somewhere between a question and an assessment. "Since I was 8 years old," Maggie said. "My aunt in Virginia kept horses. I spent every summer there until I was 16. He handed her the reins of a gray mare named Clara without another word, and they rode out into the dark with the cattle moving ahead of them like a slow river of sound and motion. She was not an expert. She made mistakes, let a group of steers break left when they should have held the line, called out directions to Danny that were technically correct but timed poorly. But she was capable and she was quick to learn, and she was completely, entirely, unself-consciously present in the work of it in a way that you can't fake. By the first night's camp, when they'd made 10 miles and Pete had built a fire and Jorge had produced coffee and biscuits from a pack that seemed to hold significantly more than its physical dimensions should allow, Maggie sat on a bedroll with her boots off and her sore feet toward the fire, and she was happy in a way she could feel in her whole body. "You kept up," Silas said, settling beside her. "Not close, just near, the way two people sit when proximity is natural rather than chosen. Did you think I wouldn't?" "I thought you might," he said. "I wasn't certain." "That's honest," she acknowledged. "I try to be. Pete, across the fire, was watching them with the careful non-expression of a man who has been watching his employer closely for 9 years and has just noticed something new. Jorge was looking at the stars. Danny had already fallen asleep at an angle that suggested he'd lost consciousness mid-thought. "What did you want to do?" Silas asked. "Before your father decided you needed to be corrected." Maggie looked at the fire. "I wanted to study botany," she said. "Formally, there are women who do it, real scientific work. I wanted to do that." "Why didn't you?" "Because my father would not permit it and I didn't have the financial independence to override him," she said, without particular bitterness, though the reality of it had a familiar edge. In Philadelphia in 1882, a woman with ambitions that exceed her father's approval requires either money of her own or the support of a husband, and I declined to acquire the latter by the available means. Silas was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "What would you study, if you could?" "The plants of the Western Territories," Maggie said immediately. "There's so much work still to be done: classification, medicinal use, the relationships between species and soil types. I have a list, actually. I've been making notes since the train from Kansas." He turned his head to look at her. "You have a list?" "I always have a list," she said, and then, because it seemed relevant, "I brought the botanical guide. I've been reading it in the evenings." "I know," he said. "I see you reading it at the kitchen table. Does that bother you?" "No," he said. "It doesn't bother me at all." The fire settled, and the cattle moved softly in the dark beyond their camp, and the stars above them were the extravagant, reckless stars of a Colorado high country sky. And Maggie Dugan thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that her father had made a very significant miscalculation. The second day of the drive was harder, the terrain steeper as they moved into the higher elevations, and by mid-afternoon a situation developed that, while not dangerous, required quick thinking. A section of the upper fence line that was supposed to contain the new pasture had come down over the winter, and Silas discovered this when the lead cattle hit the gap and began scattering into the timber. What followed was a frantic 2 hours of roundup, with everyone on horseback and Maggie riding Clara through timber she had never navigated before, calling cattle back toward the open ground with a combination of voice and movement that was partly instinct and partly a focused improvisation she was rather proud of afterward. She brought back 11 head on her own, which Pete informed her was more than Danny had managed, which Danny indignantly disputed, which Silas settled by pointing out that the actual count was 9 for Danny and 11 for Maggie, and that the matter was closed. That evening at the upper pasture camp, with the cattle settled and the fence temporarily repaired, Silas was checking Clara's left foreleg. The mare had come down hard on loose rock during the scramble, when Maggie came up beside him and crouched to examine the leg herself. He moved slightly to make room for her without pulling away, and they were close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his shoulder. "She'll be fine," Maggie said. "It's not swollen. She's just tender." "You know horses, too," he said. "You have to if you spend summers in Virginia with a woman who loves them as much as my Aunt Clara did." She glanced up. "The mare's name is coincidental, by the way." "I noticed." "Is it?" he said, and his voice had that thing in it again, that quiet, careful quality, the sound of a man choosing his words with more attention than the subject strictly required. "Her name was Clara Dugan before she married," Maggie said, standing. "She died when I was 17. She was the only person in my family who actually liked who I was." The words came out more plainly than she'd intended, and she was suddenly aware of how exposed they were, standing in the high country evening with the sun going down in spectacular orange, and the mountains making everything feel simultaneously vast and intimate. "I'm sorry," Silas said, and the simplicity of it landed exactly right. "Thank you," Maggie said, and meant it. He looked at her for a moment in the evening light, and then he looked away, back at the mare, and something passed between them in that brief exchange. Not a declaration, nothing so formal, just the first quiet acknowledgement that there was a territory between them that was worth exploring carefully. The return to the ranch after the drive felt different. Not different in any way that could be pointed at specifically, but different the way a room feels different after you've moved a piece of furniture. The same elements, the same dimensions, but the proportions have shifted. Pete noticed first, because Pete noticed everything. He had a way of being present in a conversation without appearing to participate in it. And one morning in the second week of May, when Maggie was in the kitchen garden turning compost into the soil, and Silas came by to ask her something about the pantry supplies, and ended up leaning on the garden fence for 20 minutes talking about nothing and everything, and completely forgetting about the pantry supplies he'd come to ask about. Pete walked past them with a knowing expression that he almost but didn't quite suppress. "He likes you," Danny told her that afternoon, with the complete confidence of a young man of 20 who has no business making such assessments but makes them anyway. "Mr. Kendrick, I've worked here 2 years," Danny said, "and I've never seen him lean on a fence for 20 minutes talking about nothing. He usually talks for exactly as long as the subject requires, and then he goes back to work." "Perhaps he had things on his mind," Maggie said, which was true of her own portion of the conversation as well, though the things on her mind were not particularly related to pantry supplies either. In late May, a situation arose that, in its own unglamorous way, clarified a great many things. Maggie had been exploring the lower meadows in the late afternoon, as she did several days a week with her botanical guide and the small journal she'd taken to carrying for her plant notes, when she found what she had been hoping to find: a substantial growth of a plant she'd been reading about, a native species with documented medicinal properties that was more common in New Mexico than this far north. And she was so absorbed in documenting it that she didn't notice how far she'd come or how dark the sky had gotten to the northwest. The storm that rolled in was not as dramatic as the late April storm, but it was faster and colder, and by the time Maggie realized she needed to head back, the rain had arrived and the light had dropped significantly. She knew the general direction of the ranch but not the specifics of the terrain in the dark, and she had gone farther than she realized, and for about 20 minutes she was genuinely uncertain where she was going. Silas found her, which she suspected had more to do with his knowledge of her habits and her likely route than any particular luck. He came riding out of the rain on his bay horse, a lantern in one hand and an expression on his face that she couldn't read properly in the wet half-dark. "I knew you'd gone into the lower meadow," he said, not accusatory, just matter of fact. "When the storm came and you hadn't come back, He stopped. "You came," Maggie finished. "I came," he confirmed. She was wet and cold, and her journal was somewhat the worse for the rain, and she was holding her botanical guide under her arm pressed against her side to protect it. And he swung down from his horse and put his coat around her shoulders with a naturalness that suggested it had not been a deliberated decision so much as an automatic one. And then he was very close to her, fixing the coat's collar, and they were both quite still. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. He was looking at her face in the lantern light with an expression that was, for once, entirely unguarded. "I don't want you to get lost," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it mean considerably more than its literal content. "I wasn't lost," she said with equal quietness. "I just wasn't sure where I was." "That's what lost means, Maggie," he said very gently, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and both of them were aware of it. She looked up at him. The rain was coming down steadily, and the lantern was swinging slightly in the wind, and the mountains were invisible in the dark, but they were there, exactly where they always were. "I found something today," she said, choosing to hold the moment rather than flee it, "before the storm. A plant that isn't supposed to grow this far north. I've been looking for it for 3 weeks. Did you document it?" "Somewhat. The rain was unkind to my notes." "We'll go back tomorrow," he said, "in better weather, and you can document it properly." She looked at him for a moment, this man who offered to spend his morning helping her document a botanical specimen as though it were the most natural thing in the world to do, and felt something move inside her chest like a key turning in a lock. They rode back to the ranch together in the rain, and it was not a hardship at all. True to his word, he went with her the next morning, and the morning after that as well, and then the walks into the lower meadow became a thing they did together. Not every day, but often, in the quiet of the early afternoon when the day's essential work was done. He knew the land in a way that was profoundly useful to her observations. He knew which areas flooded in spring and which drained quickly, which slopes faced which direction, and what that meant for what grew on them, where the deer trails ran, and where the elk came down from the high country in the evening. He pointed things out that she would have walked past, and she explained what she was looking for and why. And the exchange built something between them that was different from the practical arrangement they'd begun with, something more like partnership, more like the comfortable confidence of two people who have decided, without quite saying so, that the other person's presence improves things. One June afternoon, they were sitting on a flat rock above the lower meadow, eating lunch. Maggie had started packing lunch on these excursions after the rain incident, which Silas had approved of without comment, when he said, out of a comfortable silence, "I got a letter from your father." She set down her bread. "What does it say?" He pulled it from his jacket pocket and offered it to her. She unfolded it and read it. Edmund Dugan's handwriting was precise and controlled, the handwriting of a man who considered even his letters a form of self-presentation. The letter informed Silas Kendrick that sufficient time had passed for the correction to have taken effect, and that if Miss Dugan had shown adequate improvement in her disposition and her understanding of appropriate behavior, she could be sent home at the end of June. It went on to describe what adequate improvement looked like, and the list was so perfectly tailored to every quality that Maggie actually possessed that she felt a brief flare of something hot and angry in her chest before she folded the letter back up and set it on the rock between them. "He wants me to come home," she said. "That's what it says," Silas agreed. She looked out over the meadow. The wild grasses were at their peak, moving in long, slow waves in the warm afternoon wind, and somewhere in the middle distance, a meadowlark was doing its level best to improve the day. "What do you think?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. When she looked at him, his face was very composed and very still in the way that she had come to understand meant he was working out how to say something that mattered to him. "I think," he said slowly, "that I hired a housekeeper and found something considerably different, and I think," he stopped, took a breath. "I think if you go back to Philadelphia, I am going to spend the rest of my life being a considerably lesser version of what I could otherwise be." The meadowlark sang. The grasses moved. Maggie sat very still and felt the words settle over her like the first warmth after a long cold spring. "Silas," she said, "I know it's not," he started. "It is," she said. "Whatever you were about to say, it's not, it is." He looked at her then fully, without his usual guarded quality, and she saw clearly what had been quietly assembling itself behind those careful green eyes for the past 2 months. "I'm not an uncomplicated life," he said. "It's hard work and hard winters, and the nearest real city is a long ride. I have no grand offer to make." "I don't want a grand offer," Maggie said. "I've had 3 grand offers. They were all terrible." His mouth moved in the beginning of his small, honest smile. "What do you want?" She thought about her father's letter. She thought about Philadelphia and dinner parties and the accumulated small humiliations of being told, year after year, that who she was needed to be less of itself. She thought about the plants she documented in this valley, the journal that was filling up with specimens that didn't exist in the Eastern botanical literature, the view from the east window of her room every morning, the way the mountains looked at first light. She thought about this man who had offered to help her document a flower in the rain and had not once in 2 months suggested that her mind was too much or her opinions too strong or her curiosity anything other than entirely welcome. "I want to stay," she said. He was quiet for a moment that was not uncomfortable in the slightest. Then he reached across the flat rock and took her hand, which was a small gesture that was also the largest thing either of them had done. His hand was warm and work-roughened and absolutely steady. "Then stay," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "You should know," she said, because honesty seemed important, "that I will always read legal briefs during sermons if they're more interesting. I will argue with people who are factually wrong. I will probably embarrass you at dinner parties if you ever have them, though I expect you don't." "I don't have dinner parties," he confirmed. "Good," she said. "And none of those things are problems," he added, with a directness that she felt like sunlight. "Not to me. They never were." She looked at him in the afternoon light, this man who had received her as a punishment and was sitting here telling her she had never been one, and she felt something so large and clear and certain that it was almost startling love, she supposed, though the word seemed too small for the actual size of what she was feeling. Not the drawing-room variety, not the pale, polite, approved of version that her father had been trying to negotiate for her. The real kind. The kind that comes when someone sees you entirely and chooses you specifically, not despite what you are but because of it. She leaned forward and kissed him on the cheek, which was not particularly bold by any standard except the one that had governed her previous 22 years, and he turned toward her, and what had been a gentle beginning became something more, a real kiss, honest and warm and unhurried, with the meadowlark still singing and the grasses moving in the valley below. There was a letter to write, of course, 2 letters in fact. Maggie wrote hers to her father first, because it needed doing and she might as well do it while her resolve was clear, and her happiness was making her both brave and generous. She told Edmund Dugan that she would not be returning to Philadelphia in June. She told him that she intended to remain in Colorado, that she was in good health and good circumstances, and that the ranch was a fine place and the work was honest. She told him she had found in the Colorado Territory more genuine opportunity and more genuine respect than she had found in the entirety of her life in his house. She kept the tone civil, because spite was not a thing she had much use for, but she was clear and she did not apologize. Silas wrote his letter separately, and she didn't read it, because it was between him and her father and whatever arrangement had initially been made, and she trusted him to handle it with the same plain-spoken honesty he brought to everything else. Edmund Dugan's response arrived 3 weeks later. It was brief and tight, and composed in the manner of a man who has lost a negotiation he didn't realize he was in. He wrote that he was deeply disappointed, and that she was making a grave error, and that he expected she would come to regret this decision. He did not threaten to disown her, which Maggie took as either a small mercy or an acknowledgement that she had, in fact, already left in every way that mattered. She wrote back and told him she did not believe she would regret it, and that she hoped in time he would visit, because the mountains were worth seeing. She meant both things sincerely. The summer of 1882 at the Kendrick Ranch was the finest summer Maggie Dugan had ever experienced, and she was aware of this as it was happening, which is a rarer and more precious thing than it sounds. She and Silas spent the long western evenings on the porch, talking and sometimes not talking, watching the light change across the mountains through all the extraordinary registers of the Rocky Mountain sunset. She continued her botanical work, and her journal filled with observations and pressed specimens and careful notes, and Silas continued to accompany her on her afternoon excursions with a consistency that was its own kind of declaration. In July, Pete rode into Harlan Creek for supplies and came back with the news that a woman named Mrs. Hooper, the wife of the town's general store owner, was looking for someone to teach her 2 daughters to read more advanced material. Pete relayed this information in the elaborately casual manner of a man who has thought it through and is making a suggestion without appearing to make one. Maggie went into town the following week and met Mrs. Hooper, a capable and warm woman in her mid-30s who shook her hand with a directness that Maggie immediately liked. The daughters were 12 and 14, and both were smart and undersupplied with books and opportunity. By the end of the visit, Maggie had agreed to come 2 afternoons a week and teach reading, composition, and a broader curriculum than anything currently available in Harlan Creek. She also, in the course of these visits to town, made the acquaintance of several other people who became important in their own ways. The town's doctor, an overworked man named Dr. Alton, who was delighted to discuss the medicinal properties of local plants with anyone who had actually studied them. The minister's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Calloway, who had strong opinions about everything and was refreshingly willing to argue them, and a Ute woman named Naya, who came regularly to trade at the general store and who, when Maggie tried to explain her botanical interest in a plant she'd sketched from memory, looked at the sketch and named the plant in her own language and described its uses with a precision that the botanical guide did not match. This last acquaintance grew, carefully and respectfully, into something genuinely valuable on both sides. Naya had knowledge about the plants of this territory that was both more specific and more practical than anything in the books Maggie had brought, and Maggie had the means to document and preserve this knowledge in a form that could travel. They communicated through a combination of Spanish, which Maggie had some of and Naya had more, and the shared language of the plants themselves, which needed no translation. It was not a simple friendship, given the realities of 1882 Colorado and what the government's policies had done to the Ute people, but it was an honest one, and Maggie was not naive about the injustice of the circumstances that surrounded it. She knew that Naya's access to the land she moved through was increasingly constrained, that the Ute people had been pushed and pressured and confined in ways that were neither just nor justified, and she was direct about this awareness when it was relevant and did not pretend a comfort she didn't feel about the world's arrangement. She told Silas about this friendship one evening on the porch, including her concerns about the larger picture, expecting nothing in particular from him and getting, instead, a response that was both thoughtful and direct. He said he knew the situation was wrong, that the land policies were wrong, that the treatment of the people who had lived on this land before anyone like him arrived was deeply wrong, and that knowing it was wrong and being able to change it were not the same thing, but that the second fact didn't excuse comfortable silence about the first. He had the look, when he said it, of a man who had been carrying these thoughts for a long time without a suitable conversation partner, and Maggie felt another degree of the warmth she had been accumulating toward him since the first weeks. The summer moved through its long golden weeks, and things between Silas and Maggie deepened with the same steady, unhurried quality that she had come to associate with everything about him. There was no dramatic declaration, no formal moment of announcement. There was instead a gradual, thorough, unambiguous interweaving of two lives that had recognized each other as complementary and proceeded accordingly. He began including her in the decisions of the ranch, not because she demanded it, though she would have, but because he naturally brought the things he was thinking about to her, the way you bring things to a person whose judgment you respect. She brought her thinking to him in the same way. The kitchen table where he had always read his newspapers alone became a place where they read them together and argued about the news and drank coffee in the mornings and talked about everything from cattle prices to the geological composition of the ridge to the north. Pete, who had been watching all of this with the careful attention of a man with a large personal investment in the happiness of both parties, said to Danny one evening in the bunkhouse, with the serene confidence of someone stating a settled fact, "That woman is going to be Mrs. Kendrick before the leaves turn." Danny, who had made his own observations, agreed. It was on an evening in late August, when the summer was beginning to show the first faint signs of the turn toward fall, when the light had that particular quality of richness that comes right before the change, that Silas asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. They had come in from an afternoon walk to the upper meadow where she'd been documenting a late-blooming species, and they were on the porch washing the day off their hands in the basin there, and he said, with his back to her as he dried his hands. "I want to ask you something, and I want to be clear that there is no pressure in the asking, and your answer doesn't change anything about—" "Yes," Maggie said. He turned around. "I haven't asked yet. You were going to ask me to marry you," she said. "I was," he admitted. "Then yes," she said, "obviously. I've been wondering when you were going to get there." He looked at her for a moment with that expression that she now knew very well, the one that was mostly composed and just at the edges entirely unguarded. "I was trying to do it properly," he said. "You were doing it very properly," she assured him. "The answer is still yes." He crossed the porch in 2 steps and pulled her into a hold that was not tentative in the slightest, and she held onto him with both arms and her face against his neck. And the mountains were gold in the late evening light, and the whole world felt like it was exactly the right size. They were married in September of 1882 at the small whitewashed church at the end of Harlan Creek's Main Street, on a Saturday morning when the aspens on the lower mountain slopes had turned the gold that Silas had predicted, and the sky was the specific clear blue that Colorado produces in the fall as if in apology for the approaching winter. The ceremony was attended by Pete and Jorge and Danny, who had collectively put on their best clothes and managed to look almost formal. Mrs. Hooper and her daughters came. Dr. Alton came. Mrs. Calloway came and sat in the front row and cried without any apparent embarrassment. Naya came as well and stood at the back, and brought with her a small bundle of dried plants tied with a red cord, which she pressed into Maggie's hands before the ceremony with a gravity that Maggie returned with equal gravity and genuine gratitude. There was no representative from the Dugan family of Philadelphia. Edmund Dugan had not responded to the letter informing him of the wedding. This was a hurt, Maggie acknowledged privately, that she carried in a quiet back room of herself, but it was not a hurt that reached the surface of the day, which was her day and Silas's day, and belonged entirely to the life they had chosen. Silas stood at the front of that small church in his best jacket, which was still somewhat worn but was clean and pressed with evident effort. And when Maggie came down the aisle escorted by Pete, who had been asked, and had accepted with a gruffness that completely failed to disguise how moved he was, Silas looked at her with the expression of a man who has been handed something precious and knows it and means to take very good care of it. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has been given, in the guise of a punishment, the best possible version of her life, and who knows, down to her bones, that she is exactly where she belongs. The minister, who was a practical man accustomed to the business of frontier life, kept the ceremony brief. When they exchanged vows, Maggie's voice was steady and clear, and Silas's was quiet but did not waver. And when the minister pronounced them married and Silas kissed her, the small congregation of people who had come to mean something to both of them made a sufficient amount of noise for an audience 3 times its size. The autumn that followed was its own particular kind of bliss, the bliss of a new marriage in a working life, full of the small daily textures that make up a life's actual substance. Mornings with coffee and newspapers and arguments about the news. Afternoons of work, her work and his work, different but running parallel, both of them coming in at evening with the day's particular satisfactions and difficulties to put on the kitchen table and examine together. The mountains turning from gold to bare and the first snow arriving in October, early and light, and the way the ranch looked under a dusting of white, transformed and the same all at once. She wrote to her father regularly, short letters, not demanding anything, not closing any doors, reporting on the life she was living with the same honesty she brought to everything. She did not know what she expected from this correspondence, but she kept it up because the alternative complete silence felt like a door she wasn't yet ready to shut entirely. In the winter of 1882, she finished the first draft of a systematic field guide to the flora of the Harlan Creek Valley region, incorporating her own field observations, the contents of her annotated botanical guide, and a significant portion of the knowledge she had gathered from Naya, carefully attributed. She showed it to Silas on a December evening by the fire, and he read every page of it with the focused attention he gave to his geology books, and when he finished, he looked up at her with something in his face that she could only call pride, the uncomplicated pride of a person who is watching someone they love do exactly what that person was made to do. "This needs to be published," he said. "I've been thinking about that," she agreed. "I'll write to the Geological Survey office in Denver," he said. "They correspond with the Botanical Society. It's a start." She leaned across the table and kissed him, which was one of the best things about being married to a person who took your work seriously. There was no impediment to expressing appropriate gratitude. The spring of 1883 brought several developments of considerable importance, and the first and most significant was the discovery, in March, that Maggie was expecting a child. She told Silas on a Sunday morning when the weather was still cold, but the light through the east window had that particular quality that announces the turn of the season, the light that comes from a sun that is climbing higher and means it this time. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and her certainty when he came in from the morning rounds, and she simply looked at him and said, "I think we're going to need a crib." He stood in the kitchen doorway in his coat, processing this information, and then his face did something that she had never seen it do before. It simply opened like a door coming off its latch, and he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she could feel the quality of what he was feeling through his arms around her, something enormous and careful and completely, helplessly glad. "Are you certain?" he said, eventually. "Reasonably," she said. "I plan to consult with Dr. Alton, but yes." Dr. Alton confirmed her suspicion the following week and told her she was in excellent health, that the frontier air and the physical work had done her nothing but good, and that she should expect to be navigating the summer in the expansive way of a woman in her later months of pregnancy, which she received with a practical acceptance that he found refreshing. She wrote to her father about the baby, because she wrote to him about everything, and this time the response came which surprised her, and it was not the response she expected. Edmund Dugan's letter was shorter than usual and less armored, and in it, without quite apologizing, Edmund Dugan was not a man who apologized. The mechanism simply wasn't installed. He said that he was glad to hear she was well. He said that he supposed Colorado agreed with her. He said he hoped the child would be healthy. He asked, somewhat awkwardly, whether the ranch was properly winterized, which was such a spectacularly specific and pragmatic concern that Maggie read it 3 times and then laughed a little, which was not unkind. It was her father asking, in the only language he had, whether she was all right. She wrote back and told him the ranch was very well winterized, thank you, and that she was more than all right. The child was born in late November of 1883, after a night and morning of labor that Dr. Alton attended with competence, and Mrs. Calloway attended with the bustling efficiency of a woman who has done this before and considers it her personal responsibility. And the child was a boy, as healthy and loud and definitive about his existence as anyone could wish. Silas, who had been somewhere between controlled and completely undone for the preceding 12 hours, was allowed into the room when it was over and stood at the bedside looking at his wife and his son with an expression that Maggie, who was exhausted and extraordinarily happy, thought was the most undefended she had ever seen him. "He needs a name," she said. "I know." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "I was thinking Thomas, if you approve." "Thomas Kendrick," she said, trying it. "After my father," he said quietly. "He was a good man." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. "Thomas Kendrick it is," she said. "Hello, Thomas." Thomas Kendrick, who had opinions about everything from the first hour, made clear that he concurred with this decision by going promptly back to sleep. Pete's reaction to the news was to stand in the bunkhouse doorway and announce to Danny and Jorge that it was about the finest thing that had happened to this ranch since the creek changed its course back in 1878, which was a specific comparison that none of them could quite follow, but all of them agreed with in spirit. The first year and a half of Thomas's life had the dense, exhausting, luminous quality of those particular seasons, when time both slows down in individual moments and accelerates in the larger view. He was a child who seemed to have arrived already curious about everything, which nobody who knew his parents found in any way surprising. He reached for things. He watched the kitchen fire with the concentrated attention of a small scientist. He was, at 4 months, already attempting to make sense of the sounds around him, and Maggie, who observed this with the professional attention of someone who takes note-taking seriously, started a separate journal for her son. Silas, in those months, revealed a dimension of himself that she had perhaps guessed at but not fully seen, the absolute naturalness of his fathering, which had the same quality as everything else about him, unforced, steady, and entirely present. He was not a man who held his child at arm's length while the real work of the world continued elsewhere. He was a man who had a baby on one arm while he read his newspapers, who talked to Thomas with the directness he used with everyone, who carried him out to the porch in the cold evening to show him the stars, which Thomas regarded with the focused seriousness of someone encountering something important. The Field Guide in the spring of 1884 found its way to a botanical society in Denver through the channel that Silas had opened the previous winter. The response was better than Maggie had allowed herself to expect. The society was interested. Not just interested, they were impressed, particularly by the level of detail in the native plant sections and by the attribution methodology, which was more rigorous than was common in popular botanical work of the period. There was correspondence back and forth through the spring, and by summer there was a tentative agreement to publish a portion of the guide as a monograph under the auspices of the society. Maggie read the society's response letter twice at the kitchen table, then looked up at Silas across the breakfast things. Thomas was in his wooden chair beside the table, deeply engaged in a piece of biscuit that he considered more interesting than anything the adults were doing. "They want to publish it," she said. "Good," Silas said, with the calm confidence of a man who had expected this all along. "It won't be a large distribution," she said. "It's a scientific monograph, not a Maggie," he said. "It's going to be published." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that open expression, that one that was pride and love and the complete sincerity of a person who has no complicated agenda, and she felt it in her chest the way she always did, that particular warmth. "It is," she said. "It is going to be published." Thomas, apparently feeling that this moment warranted his participation, threw his piece of biscuit across the table with impressive accuracy. That summer, something happened that nobody had anticipated, and that rearranged certain furniture in the arrangement of Maggie's interior life. Her father came to Colorado. He arrived without much warning. A telegram from Pueblo saying he would be arriving on Friday, which gave them approximately 36 hours to absorb the information, and then he was there, stepping off the stage in Harlan Creek in his Philadelphia suit, looking at the main street of a frontier cattle town with the expression of a man whose mental map is being revised in real time. Silas drove into town to collect him without any particular nervousness that Maggie could detect, which was either confidence or something he was managing very well, and she stayed at the ranch and thought about everything she wanted to say, and decided she would say none of it unless it was invited, because she was not interested in the conversation her father probably expected and was interested in the possibility, however slim, that something else might happen instead. Edmund Dugan arrived at the Kendrick ranch that Friday afternoon and stood on the front porch and looked at the mountains and was quiet for a long time. He was older than Maggie remembered him, or perhaps she had always seen him as the enormous, authoritative figure of her childhood, and was only now seeing him as a man, a particular man, with a particular history that had made him this specific version of difficult. He met his grandson that evening, who was by then 18 months old and in full possession of the focused, curious personality that he was going to carry through his life. Thomas regarded his grandfather with calm assessment, and then extended a small hand full of absolute social confidence. And Edmund Dugan took it, and something in his face did a complicated thing that Maggie watched from across the room. That evening, after Thomas was asleep, the three of them sat on the porch in the September dark, and after a while Edmund Dugan cleared his throat and said, in the manner of a man who has been composing something for some time, "You seem well." "I am," Maggie said. "The ranch is," he paused. "It is a considerable operation." "Silas has built it well," she said. Silas, seated at the other end of the porch, said nothing, with the quality of a man who understands that some conversations need to happen without him in them, even when he is present. Edmund Dugan was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice with less armor in it than she had ever heard him use, "I thought I was sending you somewhere that would correct you." "I know," Maggie said. "It did not have the intended effect." "No," she agreed, "but it had a considerably better one." He looked at the mountains, which were invisible in the dark but whose presence could be felt in the way the sky was shaped against them, the stars cut off at a certain altitude and nothing above that. "I didn't know," he said, "what it was I was sending you away from." It was not an apology. Edmund Dugan still did not have the mechanism for apologies. But it was as close as he was able to come, and Maggie recognized it for what it was and took it for what it was worth, which was not nothing. "I know," she said. "The boy is—" He stopped again. "He looks like you, at that age." "I'll take that as a compliment," Maggie said. "It was meant as one," Edmund Dugan said, and looked briefly surprised by himself. He stayed for 6 days, which was long enough for a kind of tentative, incomplete reconciliation to establish itself. Not the full restoration of a relationship that had never been entirely healthy, but a beginning of something more honest, the acknowledgement between two people who are going to continue to exist in each other's lives, that they might as well do so with some degree of goodwill. On the morning he left, he shook Silas's hand and said, in a low voice that he probably thought Maggie couldn't hear from where she was standing with Thomas on her hip, "I sent her here as a correction. I understand now that I made a significant error in my assessment." Silas, in the tone of a man who has thought about what he would say in this moment and decided that simplicity is the most honest approach, said, "She was never a punishment, sir. She was never anything close to one." Edmund Dugan looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a verdict. He climbed into the wagon that would take him to the stage, and Maggie watched him go with Thomas on her hip and Silas's hand in hers, and she felt nothing so simple as triumph and nothing so pure as forgiveness, but something in between, the complicated, realistic peace that comes when two people acknowledge, without fully resolving, the shape of their history. The months that followed Edmund Dugan's visit were not dramatically different from the months before it, but they had a new quality of settledness, as though a weight that Maggie had been carrying in her peripheral vision had been set down somewhere it no longer required constant attention. She continued her letters to her father, and he continued to reply, and the letters on both sides became, very gradually, more honest than they had ever been when they were living in the same house. The ranch grew steadily through 1884 and into 1885, as ranches do when they are well managed and worked by people who care genuinely about the land. Silas added 40 head of cattle in the spring of 1884, repaired and extended the barn, and began a systematic improvement of the fence lines that Pete had been lobbying for since approximately the year of Maggie's arrival. The vegetable garden, which had been modest in 1882, was now a serious and productive affair, managed with the same focused attention Maggie brought to everything she decided was worth her effort. The botanical monograph was published in the fall of 1884 under the title, "A Field Guide to the Flora of the Central Rocky Mountain Foothills, with Notes on Native Medicinal Applications," authored by Margaret C. Kendrick. It received a favorable notice in a scientific journal published in Boston, which Silas found out about before Maggie did, and carried the clipping to her on a Tuesday morning with the expression of a man delivering something wonderful, which he was. Naya, when Maggie brought her a copy of the published work and showed her the careful attribution of her knowledge throughout it, held the pages with a seriousness that needed no translation. They sat on a flat rock above the lower meadow, the same rock more or less, where Silas had first held her hand in the June light, and Maggie read some of the passages aloud, pointing to each citation of Naya's knowledge, and Naya listened with the quality of someone hearing something they did not entirely expect from the world, the sound of their knowing being acknowledged and kept. It was not enough, Maggie thought. Against the full weight of the injustice directed at the Ute people, one careful attribution in a botanical monograph was a small and incomplete thing. But it was true, and it was real, and it would last in the form of print, and for this particular afternoon on this particular rock, it was what she had to offer, and she offered it entirely. Thomas Kendrick, at 2 years old, was a compact, determined individual who had inherited his mother's curiosity and his father's steady temperament, and combined them in a way that was producing someone quite interesting. He walked everywhere he wasn't supposed to go with absolute confidence, and had a particular interest in horses that Jorge had identified early, and was already beginning to gently cultivate, setting Thomas on a gentle old pony named Biscuit for brief circuits of the corral, while Thomas held the pommel with both hands and the expression of someone doing something very important. Silas watched these sessions from the fence with a quietness that Maggie could read entirely, the particular quietness of a man watching his child become themselves and feeling the whole weight of that privilege. She stood beside him at the fence one afternoon in the spring of 1885 and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her without looking away from Thomas and Jorge and Biscuit in the corral. The mountains were behind them, still carrying snow on the upper peaks, though the valley was fully spring green. The aspens along the creek were in their first delicate leaf, pale and luminous. Danny was somewhere in the far pasture with Pete, repairing a gate that had come apart over the winter. The ranch was making its particular sounds, the livestock, the creek, the wind in the new grass. "I want to tell you something," Maggie said. He looked down at her. "All right. When my father put me on that train," she said, "I was trying to feel glad about it because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing that it hurt. And I did feel glad. I felt the beginning of something, but I didn't know what it was yet. And now you know what it was," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Now I know what it was," she agreed. "It was this, all of it. You and Thomas and the mountains and the plants and Pete looking pained whenever anyone suggests that something on this ranch might not be perfectly done. And the kitchen table. I love the kitchen table." "The kitchen table," he repeated, and she could hear the beginning of the smile in his voice. "Where we read the newspapers and argue about things and drink too much coffee and Thomas throws food," she said. "And you look at me like I am the most interesting thing you have ever encountered. I love the kitchen table." He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned away from the corral and faced her properly, both hands on her face, and looked at her with the full unguarded openness that she considered the most precious thing she had access to in this world, more precious than the published monograph in the Botanical Journal, and all the plants she had documented and would document. "You are the most interesting thing I have ever encountered," he said, "by a significant distance." She kissed him there at the corral fence in the full afternoon, with Thomas watching from the back of Biscuit, with the alert curiosity of someone filing away data, and Jorge diplomatically finding something to examine in the opposite direction, and the mountains doing what mountains do, which is be exactly themselves without apology. In the winter of 1885, Maggie discovered she was expecting again, and told Silas in the kitchen on a January morning when the snow was deep outside, and the stove was going full, and the light through the east window was the particular pale gold of winter sun at high altitude. This time he didn't ask if she was certain. He simply stood up from the table, and the look on his face was different from the first time, just as glad, maybe gladder, but with the particular quality of a man who understands more fully now what he's being told, who knows exactly how large this thing is. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. Thomas, who was sitting on the kitchen floor with a set of wooden blocks that Pete had made him for Christmas, said two, in the pleased tone of someone who has just learned this word fits somewhere. "Two," Silas said again, and pulled Maggie to him and held her with the easy confidence of a man who has held this woman for 3 years and knows exactly how this should go. And she held onto him in the warm kitchen with the snow outside, and the whole ranch around them, and the whole life they had built together already substantial and still growing. And she thought with absolute clarity that her father had sent her out here to be diminished, and had instead sent her to the very largest version of herself. The second child arrived in September of 1885, a girl this time, with copper hair that matched her mother's, and the particular piercing attention of someone who has arrived intending to take the full measure of everything around her. They named her Clara, for the aunt who had been kind, and for the gray mare who was still going strong, and for the general principle that certain names belong to certain kinds of women, and this child looked from her first hours like someone who would inhabit the name completely. Clara Kendrick was, from the beginning, a different kind of person than her brother, which was appropriate since the world required different kinds of people. Where Thomas was steady and systematic, Clara was immediate and absolute in everything she felt and wanted. Where Thomas observed and then acted, Clara acted and then observed whether she'd been right. They were, by the time Clara was old enough to follow Thomas around the ranch, an astonishing team, the kind that arises when complementary natures combine with genuine affection. Pete maintained, until the end of his time on the Kendrick Ranch and beyond, that the day Maggie Dugan arrived on that stage and stood on the main street of Harlan Creek with her carpet bag, and her composure and her flat refusal to be diminished by the circumstances she'd been handed, was the best day that had happened to this particular stretch of Colorado since the creation of the mountains. Jorge, who was less given to declarative statements, expressed equivalent sentiments by way of a small carved wooden horse he made for Thomas and a painted clay bird he made for Clara, both delivered with the quiet completeness of a man who doesn't say more than is needed but means every syllable. Danny, who was 27 by the time Clara was born and had grown into a considerably more capable version of himself than the enthusiastic, accident-prone young man who'd been on the ranch at Maggie's arrival, said simply that the Kendrick Ranch was the finest place he'd ever worked and that he didn't plan to leave it, which was its own kind of loyalty. The field guide was expanded in 1886, incorporating 3 more years of observations and an additional collaboration with Nea that had grown both more extensive and more carefully conducted, with documentation methods that Maggie had developed specifically to ensure accuracy and proper attribution. The Denver Botanical Society published the expanded version with a proper binding and distributed it to universities in the eastern states and several in Europe, where it was received by the small and interested community of people who read such things as a genuinely useful and well-executed piece of scientific work. When the first copy of the bound expanded edition arrived at the ranch by post in November of 1886, Maggie opened it at the kitchen table and turned to the acknowledgments page, which read in part, "The author is grateful beyond adequate expression to S.A. Kendrick, without whose knowledge of this land, consistent support of this work, and complete refusal to believe that any of it was anything other than entirely worth doing, this guide would not exist in any form." Silas read it over her shoulder. She had said nothing about including him in the acknowledgments, had simply done it, and was quiet for a moment. "S.A. Kendrick," he said. "Silas Andrew Kendrick," she said. "I thought it was more formal, scientific." "It's very formal," he said. He put his hands on her shoulders from behind and pressed his mouth to the top of her head. "Thank you. You made it possible," she said simply. "You made it," he said. I just made the table you worked at." "I told you," she said, tilting her head back to look up at him. "I love the kitchen table." They were, in the spring of 1887, 5 years from the afternoon Maggie Dugan had stepped off a stage in Harlan Creek with a carpet bag and a second-hand botanical guide, and the unwitting gift of a father who had tried to reduce his daughter, and had instead delivered her to the exact life she had been made for. 5 years from the moment Silas Kendrick had looked at a young woman of 22 who had just told him her father intended her visit as a punishment, and had thought, with the quiet certainty that was characteristic of everything he did, that she was no punishment at all. In those 5 years, the ranch had grown. The family had grown. The work had accumulated in the best way work accumulates when it is done by people who are suited to it and committed to it, and have the good fortune of doing it together. Thomas was 4, sturdy and curious, already following Pete and Silas around the property with a seriousness that everyone found both useful and hilarious. Clara was 18 months old and had opinions about everything, and was not shy about expressing them, which surprised no one who had met her mother. On a Sunday morning in April, Maggie sat on the porch steps with her coffee and her journal, making notes about a species of early blooming flower she'd found in the South Meadow the previous day. The light was sharp and clean, the way it is in the high country when the air still carries a memory of winter, but the sun means business. Thomas was with Silas at the corral. She could hear them, Silas's voice, low and explanatory, Thomas's higher, asking questions, the good sounds of a father and a son and a Saturday morning. Clara was asleep inside. Maggie set down her coffee and looked at the mountains, which she had been looking at for 5 years from this same porch, and which had not yet become ordinary and she did not believe would. They rose above the valley in the morning light, enormous and particular, each peak distinct, the snow on the upper elevation still present and expected, the lower slopes already green and thickening toward the full abundance of the Colorado spring. She thought, as she sometimes did on mornings like this, about the train from Philadelphia, about the telegram that had preceded it, about Edmund Dugan at his writing desk, composing what he believed was a sentence and was actually, though he would not have used this word, a rescue. She thought about the word punishment and what her father had meant by it and what it had produced, and she felt the irony of it not as bitterness. That particular feeling had been worn smooth a long time ago, but as something closer to wonder. The wonder of a life that had arranged itself around a mistake. Silas came across the yard toward her, Thomas riding on his back with the complete confidence of a child who has never doubted that this particular shoulder is available, and he settled onto the porch step beside her and Thomas scrambled down and went to investigate something in the garden with the purposeful energy of a small scientist. "Good morning," Silas said, looking at her face. "Good morning," she said. "Very good." He picked up her coffee, which she had set down, and had a sip, which was one of those small domestic liberties that sounds trivial and is actually a form of complete intimacy, and handed it back. "What are you writing?" "The South Meadow flowers," she said. "They're early this year. I want to document the timing. In connection with the temperature data you've been keeping." "Exactly," she said, and she looked at him and felt the warmth of being known, the specific, irreplaceable warmth of being with a person who pays attention to what you are doing and why. Thomas, from the garden, reported a worm with the urgency of someone who has made a scientific discovery. "Excellent," Maggie called back. "Put it back carefully." "It's a very large worm," Thomas specified. "Document it and put it back," she said, and she heard Silas make the quiet sound of a man successfully containing amusement. They sat together on the porch steps in the spring morning, with the ranch around them and the mountains beyond, and the children present in the ways that children are, Thomas in the garden with his worm, Clara sleeping inside with the absolute commitment of an 18-month-old taking a morning nap, and the coffee growing cold and the journal open on her knee and his shoulder warm against hers, and the whole complicated, extraordinary, deeply ordinary gift of the life they had made together spread around them in every direction. Her father had sent her west as a correction. as a reduction, as a reminder of her place in a world that had specific and limited ideas about what a woman's place was. He had expected the frontier to humble her. He had expected hard work and rough conditions and distance from everything. He considered civilization to flatten something in her that had always been, to him, too large. What had actually happened was that she had arrived in a valley at the foot of the Rocky Mountains and found, in the form of a quiet rancher with green eyes and geology books with annotated margins, and an absolute unquestioning regard for exactly who she was, the one thing that a life requires to become fully itself, which is someone who sees it clearly and loves it without reservation. Silas reached over and turned a page of her journal, not reading it, just a touch, the reflex of a man who is comfortable in the space where his wife does her work. She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched Thomas make his solemn way back from the garden, hands cupped around a large worm being transported with scientific care to an undisclosed location. "I want to go back to the South Meadow tomorrow," she said. "Early before the heat." "I'll come," he said. "You have the east fence to finish." "It'll keep," he said. "The meadow doesn't." She smiled at the mountains. "That is the most uncharacteristically impractical thing you've said in approximately 6 months." "I have my moments," he said. Thomas arrived at the porch steps and held out his cupped hands to show them the worm, which was indeed notable for its size and which was treated by both his parents with the serious appreciation that a genuine scientific specimen deserves. "Back to the garden," Silas said. Thomas considered this. "Or the creek," he said. "Garden," Maggie said. "The creek is for when I'm with you." Thomas considered this negotiation and accepted it with the pragmatism of a 4-year-old who understands that some terms are non-negotiable. He went back to the garden. The worm was restored to its proper home. Clara slept. The mountains held their place in the sky with the imperturbable presence of something that has been doing this for millions of years and expects to go on doing it. Silas and Maggie sat together on the porch in the spring morning, and there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left reaching toward an answer, nothing incomplete. There was only the life they had chosen and built and were living, fully and with both hands in this wide and specific and extraordinary place. It was, as her father had intended, the farthest she had ever been from home. It was, as the mountains had known all along, exactly home.